Welcome to another episode of the SparCom podcast, where we talk about trends and what's coming next. I'm Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
And we're here to talk to you today about trends and disruptive innovation. How are things going for you, Adam?
I'm cold. It's turning into winter. I don't like this very much.
Well, it happens. Another trend, right?
Inevitable. The question is, am I prepared for the inevitable?
So that's a really good segue into some of the topics I want to talk about today. Of course, we have the election just behind us, but somehow we're still in the middle of it. And of course, we have the impending cold and the winter coming. And it gave me some food for thought regarding when we know something's coming and somehow we still don't prepare for that. So I know that you've got some interesting topics because of your background as a Forbes columnist and some of the research that you've done over the years. You really looked at a lot of different companies and the opportunities they had to make a move, but ultimately they didn't. So let's start there.
Sure. Well, the interesting thing to me about this election was that it occurred in the middle of a pandemic. I imagine this is the only time in my life that I'll ever see something like this happening. And so I was always looking for what's the impact of the pandemic on the election as it moves forward. We've got an illness that we know is 50 times more deadly than the common flu. It's killed 240,000, almost 250,000 Americans. The rate of illness is at the highest that it's ever been. It's actually exceeding when the pandemic first started. And the positivity rate, meaning the percentage of people who are testing positive, is at all-time highs. So the point here is that as people go to the polls to vote, we were in the middle of a pandemic. Now, that's a fact. Now, let's go from those facts to a factoid. In the counties in the United States that have been hardest hit by this recent wave of the pandemic, the incumbent president, Donald Trump, actually increased his vote over what he received 4 years ago when we were not in a pandemic. And this sort of struck me because I was thinking, if I lived somewhere and I was seeing my family members and my friends get sick and I've seen an increase in the rate of illness, would I be happy to pursue the person who hasn't seemed to have gotten his arms around this problem? And in fact, the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, just a couple of weeks ago said that they'd given up on trying to control the pandemic. That wasn't even part of the plan. And it seemed like, well, that would be you wouldn't want that. You would want somebody that would be more interested in trying to control the pandemic. But that's not the way people behaved.
No.
People went out and they behaved differently. Like I said, the vote for Donald Trump, the incumbent, actually increased. And what that did was it reminded me of the study that I started 14 years ago that's ongoing, and that's that longitudinal study of talking to organizations that got into trouble. And what I would do is I would go talk to the executives and I would say to them, okay, you're in this business and you see these trends, right? And they would nod their heads up and down, yes, we see the trends. I said, and you do realize these will have an impact on your business? And they would say, yes. A good example of this is I knew a company that was in the printing equipment business. And as I talked to executives, I said, well, you do know that printing equipment is just going to decline because there's Xerox machines, which you don't need a printing equipment for, right? And then there's, of course, just everybody having their own desktop printer. And then of course, there's just obviating the need of printing equipment altogether because you do things digitally, shared PowerPoint presentations and Adobe files and things like that. And they would nod their heads up and down. And I would say, so what are you doing to prepare for this change and keep your company relevant and not just disappear into history? And they would say, nothing.
Yeah.
And I would look at them and I'd say, wait a minute, this is coming. For example, why wouldn't you just go get a job in a high growth company? Why wouldn't you leave? Why would you stay there? And inevitably the answer, well, this is what I do and this is what our company does. And, we're just going to kind of let it go on.
Right. I bet that was a pretty popular conversation, right?
And it would always fascinate me. And I would start talking to them about, well, could you change? Could you behave differently? And then I started to do some research. And I discovered that in the military does a lot of analysis of their soldiers. And back in World War II, there was a serious problem of soldiers or pilots in the Army Air Corps would have their plane would get hit, it would be in horrible condition, and the pilot would not eject. And then they would ride the plane right into the ocean or ride the plane right into the ground, and it would kill them dead. And the question that they kept asking was, why didn't these fellows eject from the plane? Well, the myth was, oh, we're pilots and we always think we can get out of everything. But the more they studied it, the more they found out that wasn't what happened at all. The reality was that as long as they were sitting in the cockpit, they felt like they had some control because they were flying the plane. If they hit the eject button, they didn't know what was going to happen. And the fear of not knowing what's going to happen was greater. As long as they had a hold of that flight stick, they didn't worry about, they were facing inevitable death, yet they wouldn't hit the eject button. And then they had another problem, which was when the bullets would fly, soldiers had no problem getting into a foxhole. That's an easy one to teach, right? But when you get in the foxhole, then the guys on the other side, they're shooting at you. Well, they start radioing back to the guys that have the big guns, the mortars and that sort of thing. And they start saying, lob one in. And they keep getting closer and closer and closer to the foxhole. So what the Army knew was that as soon as you got in a foxhole, your number one job was to get out of the foxhole.
Right.
But the problem was that once they were in a foxhole, then it was kind of like, well, wait a minute, I got to get back out there where the bullets are.
Yeah.
So, but it's inevitable. If you stay here, you're going to die. Yeah, but I'm not dead yet.
Yeah, it's a little bit of the devil you know versus the devil you don't know, right?
Yeah. And so that sort of evolved into studies of what we call confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is where when you're in a problem, you will tend to gravitate towards data that make you think that your problem isn't as bad as you think it is. And that maybe you don't have to do anything, at least not today. So you look for those cues around you, and you look for the signals to let you say that it's okay to stay where you are. It's okay to continue to behave the way you behave. And in this case, the incumbent president had gone to many of these places, and his message was, you don't have to worry about the pandemic. It's almost over. We're going to round the corner. Everything will be fine. You're going to learn that the pandemic isn't really as bad as they say, and once the election is over, the news media is going to quit talking about the pandemic. Now, these statements were all patently false statements, but it's what people wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And so they went and listened to it, to the point to put themselves in serious jeopardy. I mean, at one point, the incumbent gave a presentation in Nebraska. They bussed a lot of people to the presentation. Presentation ended. The speech, he was done with his speech, he left. And these people were stranded there for hours, couldn't get back to their vehicles. And some of them got very, very ill from the cold, had to be hospitalized. Yet, they voted for the person that left them there.
Yeah.
So again, it's this confirmation bias that I wanted to hear that. Now, this is something that's gone on for hundreds of years. Those of us that, a little bit older might have had to read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey when they were going to school. I mean, I was one of those guys. And in the Odyssey, Homer tells a story of coming upon the island of Titan. And on the island of Titan are these sirens. The sirens are, these sort of mermaid-like mythical characters. And they would sing so beautifully that the people on the ships would gravitate over to listen to the sirens singing on the shores, and they would crash the ship. And the reality was that there were all these crashed ships, and everybody knew about this, but the sirens were irresistible. Mm-hmm. And so in the story, Homer has himself lashed he pours wax into the ears of all of his crew, then he lashes himself to the main staff, and he's told his crew, under no circumstances do you follow any of my orders, you must continue to sail in this direction. And then he listens to the sirens of Titan screaming and yelling for them to take the ship into where it would be destroyed. So the point here, that was written a couple, 1600 years ago, I think it was now, long time ago. But it's that story of how we will let the sirens draw us towards what we want to do. We will listen to the sirens to go down the direction that makes us feel good, that makes us feel comfortable, rather than looking at the real data, deciding what we really need to do, and making those affirmative decisions. And so I saw that happening. It was interesting in the election, but it made me think about all these business people that have done the same thing. There's no doubt. They knew what was coming at Toys R Us.
Yep.
They saw e-commerce, right?
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, why didn't they do something about it, right? I mean, I'm kind of pitching this out there. Have you seen this in your business?
I've seen it countless times. I've seen it in my own business. I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in friends and other business owners. When I was at the helm of my company, we kind of saw the writing on the wall. we saw that the business we were in was basically product development and engineering services. And I saw that a lot of my employees would come and work for me for a few years and then go to the 800-pound gorilla in town, which is Raytheon Missile Systems, make a lot more money. And I saw that, and I still blindly didn't change my way of doing things, because I figured, we'll just keep on, we'll figure it out on the way. But that was one of my Achilles heels, because finding a good resource base of engineers and talent, it was critical to our business. And not having the right people in the right place on the bus was one of the things that brought me down eventually, and it was a huge lesson for me. So I see the confirmation bias in my own past, and obviously since you and I have been working together, I've been more aware of it. And by just being aware of it, I think I've made some decisions that have gone beyond it. And I'm interested in what you have to say around how we get past it. We see the incoming train, we're standing on the rails. What do we do to get away from this situation?
Yeah, in a way, when I talk about these things, it can sound like people are stupid, right? Okay, if you were at Toys R Us, why didn't you do something, right? Like, it's obvious, do something. And the reality is, yes, but the question they'll ask themselves is, do what? What does he want me to do? And with that, I started to realize that we needed to think about this the way we think about all kinds of risks, right? If you're going to go buy a house, you think about what's the risk of the community you're going into. I mean, you think about what the risks are and what you do. But what we don't often think about is when we're running our business and we're running it well, we don't quantify the risk of external change. I call that status quo risk. I've been talking to people about it for about a decade now.
Yeah.
The status quo risk is the risk that is created by staying in your existing business model in a changing world. I mean, you can continue to do what you've done, do it very, very well, be operationally excellent. But if the world moves, then what happens is you get obviated. That's the Toys R Us problem with e-commerce.
Yeah.
So we have to say, how do we measure this status quo risk? And if we start to measure the status quo risk, then we start to understand both what's causing the risk and how to deal with it. So how do you do that? External data. If you're running Toys R Us and you're looking constantly at what's my sales per store, what's my sales per square foot, what am I doing in my different categories inside the store, what's my success, how many customers am I getting per day, how many customers, what's the average ticket size or the average basket size. Those are all great metrics for running a bunch of stores. But they're not the metrics that are going to tell you if you're going to get status quo risk. What would that be? Well, start off with, we should be measuring e-commerce. What's the growth in e-commerce? What's happening among that other world? What's happening amongst our competitors? If Target's sales are toy sales are being adjusted, are they going up or are they going down? What's happening with sales of toys at Sears? Then what's happening with sales of toys at independent standalone toy sites on the internet? And what's happening with sales of toys at a monster like Amazon, right? Now, what we do is that starts to get us to see the data that starts to see, wait a minute, well, our business isn't growing and we're not doing anything wrong, but we're starting to see we could have problems in our business. We're seeing these other businesses start to do better, right? And so that external data can now get us to where we can actually start to quantify the status quo risk. We can start to say, wow, if that goes up 5% externally, then the impact on my profits will be this. And now if we quantify it that way, we're much better trained to think about how to adjust our operations, right? How to go do something differently, because we can actually now not see it as a binary, am I alive or am I dead? But rather a shifting of time, a shifting of the market, and the need that we have to shift our business.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to the status quo risk. The gasoline that drives that engine, I think, has to do with fear. This is something we've talked about in the past, and it's something that's very, very important to me to understand that people are fearful. They don't want to see what's around the corner. They see the train's coming, but it's familiar. Like the pilots in your story there, they know what they have in front of them, but they don't know the unknown, which is ejection into the sky.
Right.
And ultimately, we know these trends are coming. We have the controls of our own ship. And if we shift over to some other market, or we shift away from what we know, it's taking us into the unknown.
Right.
And I put a quote on our Instagram page the other day regarding fear is a compass. And we're trained as human beings, when we're little kids, and even in our own DNA and our evolutionary DNA, to if something gives us fear, we stay away from it. But in the end, if we want to break free and be successful and rise up to those other levels, we have to go towards our fear. And that is like completely unobvious in what you do in life.
So let's go back again. And let's start where I was, which was, we have something we can see on the horizon and we see it coming, and why do we not do something about it? Well, the first thing is, are we getting the external data? It's quite clear that the people that were voting in those districts were not paying a lot of attention to the data, and they were happier to listen to these statements that in fact the COVID was going away when it wasn't, right? So the first part is get the real data, get the facts. Don't lie to yourself. Don't let confirmation bias send you off looking for data that says that you don't need to worry. To the contrary, go look for the data that says that you should worry. That's a better thing to do. The second thing is training. Let's go back to the guys and the pilots and the guys in the foxhole. What did the military do? They said, well, okay, if a pilot is afraid of ejecting, what do we have to do? We got to make him not afraid of ejecting. So what do? First of all pilots have to jump out of an airplane. Go to paratrooper school, jump out of an airplane, find out what that's like. Second, could we develop or rig up some kind of a fake ejection device? Something that we could put out here in a field, that we could have something, 100 foot off the ground or 200 foot off the ground. He hits a button and boom, it acts like a cockpit and ejects the guy up. And now he has had the experience. Could we make films of this, and then we could start to distribute the films, and we could talk to people about the ejection process, what works, what doesn't work, what you can anticipate when the parachute will open. Now, once we start this process of education, then what happens is the fear starts to go away. Same thing with the guys in the foxhole. What you see, if you watch any popular television show about the military, you see training. Today it's not foxholes, it's videos of people walking around inside of buildings, because warfare is very different than it used to be. But it's training people how to be prepared for these situations. We don't do enough of that in business. When we, take for example, Toys R Us, once you start to see the data coming in, it says, okay, we've got some things in e-commerce, we need to go train, right? So we need to set up some experiments. We need to go off and start doing some e-commerce, get our toes wet, see what it feels like, see what works, read up on what the competition is doing, see what they've done successfully, see who's failed, explain why they failed, right? And now what we've done is we've started to say, okay, I can quantify the status quo risk, and I can start to train with programs that can move me towards a different solution. Because again, we don't want this to look binary. In the case of the printing equipment company, it's like, I've got printing equipment, and I don't know what else I would do.
Yeah.
Could they have gotten into digital displays? Or there's a lot of things they could have done.
Right.
The point was they weren't really collecting the data. And then they were like, well, that's not my business. Okay, it's not your business, but could you start? Could you experiment? Could you start to head in a different direction? Like Toys R Us, could you set up some kind of a smaller operation, experiment with e-commerce, and see how it would work? Or that's very different than digging in your heels and saying, I'm going to fight the e-commerce. I'm going to hang on as long as I can. I'm going to try to push the trend away. Pushing trends away just never works.
I was thinking about what Sears could have done. And in our training, we've got a course on innovation that we'll be releasing here very shortly. One of the examples has to do with, one of the homework examples has to do with the point in time when the executives at Sears went left instead of right. When they dug in their heels and said, we're going to continue building stores, we're going to continue wanting to be the anchor tenant in these malls that aren't being built anymore either. At a moment in time, they could have gone a different direction, and they could have been a much different company now. I mean, they're down to like 60 stores. They could have been, think about it. They had all these stores everywhere. They have all these built-in warehouses. They could have been the next Amazon if they were smart about it. They could have done fulfillment out of these stores. They already have a service crew that would go out and fix washers and dryers. Well, they could have been the early delivery drivers. I mean, it could have been a way different story, but as we were talking about here and in the past, they didn't follow the trends. Right. They dug their heels in.
You know, I follow retail a lot, and I've been following Walmart for well over 15 years. And one of the things that's interesting about Walmart was that their market capitalization froze at about $325 to $350 billion back about 6-7 years ago. And no matter what happened, the market cap wasn't getting any bigger than that. Last quarter, their market cap increased by $80 billion. Huge jump.
Wow.
Now, why did that happen? And it's really easy to see why. For the longest time, they operated stores. And then they went and they bought an e-commerce company, Jet, and they said, okay, we're going to do some e-commerce. But they never really did it. You know, it was kind of like, yeah, we still were Walmart. And we got Sam's Club stores, and we're trying to manage that. And over here is some e-commerce thing. And really, we just hope that people will order on the e-commerce site and come to the store and pick it up, right? But they didn't put any emphasis trying to say, I'm going to make e-commerce really shine. That wasn't what they wanted to do. Boom, in comes the COVID. Down comes the lockdown. People struggle to get into stores. People want to shop from home. And suddenly, the people at Walmart are forced to take a look over here and say, wait a minute, could these guys that do the e-commerce stuff really help us out? And now all of a sudden, they're making the move. They're starting to make that move. They're starting to say, okay, now, and they got to realize how they were drug kicking and screaming towards that, right? To nearly they had to have their stores closed down in some markets and dramatically reduce the number of entrants, and people quit walking in the stores. I mean, what happened was a horrific pandemic, but it finally got them to say, oh, wait a minute, this thing on this, what I consider to be a little side business, is going to take much more of a front and center position.
Right.
Now, the good news is they bought that, what was it, 4 years ago? And so they had this, like I said, training. So they had some training. They had a part of the organization. Kind of think of it as their Navy SEALs or their Green Berets, or this group over here that was training for this other kind of way of fighting the marketplace battle. And now they were able to go front and center with it. So again, we tend to want to do this in business. We tend to want to lock in. We tend to want to go in a certain direction. And we look for reasons to think we're doing good. What we don't do enough of is looking externally and getting external data. What is happening out there? Are people with alternative solutions growing? Are alternative technologies coming to the forefront? What's happening in the world that could affect my business, affect my product, affect my distribution, affect my pricing, affect my ability to reach my customers through my promotion? What's happening out there, that could affect my business? And then bringing that into a model that we measure. Like let's take, for example, consumer goods. Companies like Procter and Gamble and these big companies, Kraft, for years, they had a pretty easy game. You had to be huge in order to have enough revenue in order to buy broadcast advertising. So once you got to broadcast advertising, you could go on ABC, NBC, CBS, and then you could quash down the small guys. They weren't ever going to be able to step up and reach you. What do we see happen? A change in media. People's viewership habits change dramatically. First, it's onto the cable channels, but then it becomes to the internet, and now we're into the sort of the Hulu and Netflix world. Their ability to use that giant advertising muscle dissipates as broadcast dissipates. And so what it allows is smaller competitors, lighter foot competitors can now come in and they can advertise on social media. They can set up YouTube videos for their product. They can get aggressive about talking to folks about the product on places like Facebook, far, far lower cost. So this change in promotion now has had this big impact. And Kraft, of course, is in really serious trouble these days. We talked about that a couple of podcasts ago. But all the big guys are. So again, this is an issue of paying attention too much to what you do in your business model, the way it is, and not enough to looking at the external world and your value proposition. What is it I'm actually delivering, right? And then thinking about how do I measure these things in the outside world so that I measure the risk that's created by me doing the same thing day after day. And then where's my training? Where am I learning how to behave differently?
What people don't understand, and it's again, unconventional wisdom, unconventional thought, is that right now as an entrepreneur or a small company, they have the most, and we have the most opportunity ever to compete against these giant, quote unquote, behemoth companies. You mentioned craft. Craft is on the ropes, right? And you can have all these smaller companies that can outmaneuver and out pivot and out trend watch the big animal.
That's right.
And this is happening all the time. And
Right.
one thing I'll mention here before we close is, we talk about trends, and it isn't always just the singular trend. It's a combination of trend. It's a kaleidoscope of trends that we need to be cognizant of if we want to navigate our ship past the siren's song to the safe harbor of sustainable success. So any parting words, Adam?
Yeah, people should be asking themselves, do I have a future scenario? Have I said what the world's going to look like in 3 and 5 years? And am I letting that drive my planning? Or am I letting my history drive my planning? The world's going to be a different place in 5 years.
Yes.
If you're letting history drive your planning, you're likely to miss the target. Just getting those scenarios together, looking at the collection of trends, the kaleidoscope, as you called it, Manny, that's going to helps people be successful.
Awesome. Well, thank you for everybody for being part of our show today, and look forward to sharing with you the news on our upcoming course. Pretty excited about that.
Dynamite.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of the week, Adam, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye-bye.